Hi everyone and welcome to the captions. We're delighted for you to join us today in person and online for this in conversation between our artist Justin Fitzpatrick and writer Paul Trinity. So we'll be taking ingredients and bodies from our exhibition Alpha and we'll explore Fitzpatrick's painting, sculpture and the unique pairings of works with the Leeds University Library galleries and special collection works. So we really thank the generous support of Lobster projects and the Henry Moore Foundation for their support on Alpha Salad. So Justin Fitzpatrick lives in Montargis in France, and his practice explores conceptual metaphors, so metaphors that structure our worldview and perspective. His work has been included in exhibitions in the UK and internationally. Recent solo exhibitions include Omega Salad at 7 p.m. in London, 2020, Pulsation at the R3 Foxy Production in New York, 2019, and Horizon Sultana Paris, 2019. And we're also delighted to welcome Paul Trinity, writer based in London, and is currently lecturer at the art department at Goldsmiths University of London. And previously held positions as senior editor at Leeds magazine, and was the 2019 to 2021 Royal Academy Resident in Critical Practice. He's written for Freeze, Art Review, and Art Monthly, and also a number of other magazines and podcasts. So without further ado, thank you both.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah? Good. Okay. So I think I told you I wrote a slightly mad introduction to this because it's such a dense exhibition. So this might be terrible or it might be genius, but who knows? But today I think the talk is roughly going to follow the order of the rooms in the show, an order that we might liken to service à la Russe. A procession of courses from farm to table, as it's fashionable to say these days. So Fitzpatrick's show is all about the gourmand and the decadent, how matters of class, sexuality, morality, and the body get mixed up in judgments of taste and the figure of the aesthete. We start with the growing of vegetables, the sourcing of meat, and seafood courses, and then into the kitchen and the restaurant itself, where servers, eager to bend over backwards for their clientele, flush with embarrassment perhaps at their passivity or their place in the caste system. Neither nor buff consumer, nor buff producer, nor effeminate consumer. As Fitzpatrick's borrowings of religious and decadent imagery attest, judgments of taste have a vexed relationship to those of morality. On the one hand, there is the absolute moral judgment of the good or bad, the poisonous and sinful, that seeks to rise above the physical into the metaphysical, although it also seems preoccupied by what we put in or do with our bodies. On the other, the aesthetic judgment borrows from these terms and yet inverts them. So the bad becomes delicious, the gamey, the delicacy, artifice becomes privileged, and pleasure over the aesthetic. The ascetic, the unadulterated or the honest. And as Joseph Litvak has reminded us, until the 18th century, to be sophisticated actually meant to be perverse, too cultivated, and therefore unnatural and suspicious. I think these queer implications of sophistication persist often now in the figure of the gay tastemaker or the inverter of judgments of value. Of course, the aesthete makes a judgment only by striking out against orthodoxy and declaring a new fashion. But they also speak to the odd class position of the homosexual, who on the one hand is associated with a kind of bourgeois refinement, the worlds of fashion and the arts, who to make sense or compensate for their difference gravitates towards the creative art, the creative industries. On the other hand, historically, queers have been economically marginalized, pushed into the service industries. We might think of the actor or artist who ends up as waiter or server, unable to rely upon family wealth or support, but we might also think about the ways in which capital is supported by a kind of Protestant moral order. So that is the sacrificing of pleasures and reorienting them towards production, or diverting our lust for consuming one another onto products that can be bought and sold. And the aesthete seems to invert this in a certain sense, that the tastemaker is always consuming other bodies. Not only do they love pleasures, but they are interested in the tastes of others. And so rather than divert, they are actually interested in the anthropomorphic or personified in the fashionable object. So on the one hand, the aesthete has a kind of revenge, making the disgusting wonderful. The spoiled becomes the delicacy, as I said. Or we might say there's a kind of Jean Genet-like idea of releasing oneself from value systems by liking what is hated by everybody. So that the rules no longer apply and you achieve a kind of saintly grace. And I think that idea of desire as being tied to death, or a certain kind of annihilation of the self, also runs through Fitzpatrick's show. On the other hand, the need to clothe oneself in luxury as a gay man often betrays that kind of objection. It doesn't release us from it, but it seems like a bad cover job. The perfume never quite covers the stench of one's objection in a way. And so we discriminate precisely because our sexual practices fail to discriminate. We cannot choose between the tasteful sexual act and waste, the anal and the abject in certain sense. So queerness both uses taste, I think, to kind of overcome its oppression, and at the same time, it always signals back to it, to this kind of play. And maybe there's also, and I think this comes through in Fitzpatrick's show, a particular relation of the homosexual to bittersweet or ambivalent pleasures. Young gay men may fantasize about luxury, but they also, in order to get out of a mundane and phobic childhood, but at the same time, they also love to wreak a certain revenge on established orders of value by bitching about them or gossiping. So in a certain sense, they love to worship and complain about things. Or in the culinary language of this show, they like to dish and eat shit. The working class homosexual is in even a more tricky position. In order to make sense of themselves, they gravitate towards urban gay life, and thus become estranged from their working class background. At the same time, because of that working class background, they never quite fit in the world of the gourmand or artistic pursuits either. And their sexuality means that their masculinity is always suspect, barring them from the only working class role acceptable in queer culture, which is that of the macho rough trade. And all of these moral, ethical, and social complications, I think, are served up in different ways in your show. And so I just wanted to kind of take that moment to unpack
some of the... Fantastic. I really like that. No, but that's it.
We'll go home now.
I just could not say anything after that. That's incredible.
Oh, good. That had the desired effect. Well, I suppose I want to start maybe by asking you, before we go through the show, about what it was about taste that particularly... It seems like an almost old-fashioned topic.
Yeah.
We were not meant to, in relation to art, make judgments of taste. We're meant to make political judgments, or we're meant to engage in almost puritanical critique. So what was it about taste and pleasure that seemed to you important as a topic to explore?
I mean, I think it's just that. I think it's there's in a kind of contemporary practice that taste and aesthetics in general are distrusted. Maybe, that's not the way it is anymore, but it's kind of in the last 50 years of history, this has been the case of that critique is always kind of trumping the visuality and the pleasure in the visuality. But really with taste, for me, it's what I found fascinating is always relate it back to the physicality of taste. And I've always really, the idea that those two things are metonymic, they're connected to each other. The idea of an aesthetic taste and of a kind of cultural taste is always connected to the body and what is good for the body and what is bad for the body on one line, on this kind of, on the idea of kind of morality, but also what is pleasurable for the body and how the body relates to the world. And so with taste specifically, so much of taste is just a kind of, it is cultural coding and kind of being taught things culturally. And so the things that actually give you pleasure are sometimes the things that you were having to kind of hide from the world and put away, and you're supposed to align yourself with certain kind of values. And so it's not, good taste is coming in from outside, but also there is this idea that we forget about taste, that it is about pleasure, it is about relativity, and it is about your relationship to the world. And so in this show, I was always just trying to unpack those two things and play them off against each other, not to kind of binarize it like that, but to use it as a kind of position to move out and explore in a kind of visual sense.
Yeah, because I mean, of course, good taste has kind of class or ideological implications. Like, to know good taste is to belong in a certain sense.
Yeah.
On the other hand, to denounce taste as always complicit is its own kind of class judgment.
Yeah.
Right? It depends on a certain education in, let's say, Marxism, or, you know, that is also kind of fairly bourgeois. Right?
Yeah.
So that rejection of pleasure.
Well, it's just this idea of sophistication. I think also specifically because I come from a painting background, and if you study painting and you do your master's in painting, there's such a limited kind of frame, and we're working with paint on canvas. It really is like just a square, and so it just becomes about what is more sophisticated, what is more tasteful, and it's just you have so many exterior voices in your head when you're working in painting as a student, at least, because you want to get it right, but you're also having to kind of reconcile that with your own desire and your own pleasure, and it takes so long to find some kind of, I don't know, some threshold where you can be who you are while also you're not exempt from society, you're not divorced from it. You still care what people think, and you care about those judgments and those descriptions of value, you know. So, yeah.
But you start the show not with a painting, but with a sculpture, this kind of motor ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is almost like a kind of multi-directional chariot that sits outside of the show, and next to it you have this kind of kitchen trolley that's full of sinew and muscle. Why did you want to start the show with these two works that aren't necessarily painted?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of it's more that I had this, with the Tetley, there was this beautiful space, and it really, as soon as I saw the space, it really, I knew almost exactly what to do with that space, because it is this linear movement, and so it felt like this digestive tract already, and I was like, it feels so, there's a closed loop, and so everything in the atrium is anything that was going to sit outside of that, and maybe that could be almost like the amuse-bouche for the whole show, but it doesn't have to kind of continuously kind of connect to this kind of narrative that we have. And so the atrium space, the works in it, the sculptural works, are maybe expressing more generally themes of the show, but not in the kind of like chapter 1, chapter 2 of the show that I did already. So they stand aside from it, and the themes in them are connected, but not necessarily to be read in the same way as the rest of the show. If that makes sense.
But there's that idea of Bergson, I think, was kind of interesting for motor ideals. How, I suppose, why did you want to, what was interesting about Bergson's work that you wanted to kind of realize through that sculpture?
Yeah, just to say, this sculpture was a collaboration with my partner, with Niels Alex Tabling. So we worked on it, and it was a commission for Maison Populaire in Paris, in Montreuil. But yeah, so it was Bergson, his text, Matter and Memory. And what was exciting about it was this, he's talking about the idea of consciousness. And then he says that, you know, you're always in your body, but you have this relationship to all the accumulation of experiences are kind of in your memory. And you cannot divorce your sense of self from, you can't just live in your body, and you can't just live in your memory. So that thing is, you can never be one or the other. But as an abstract in this book, he separates the two into pure presence and pure memory. And I found it super interesting because in that separation, he kind of makes explicit there's a kind of inversion of power that both have. So to be purely present, to be purely in your body, is to have all of the kind of physical agency at hand, and you have all this capacity, but you have no self to work from, no basis to make decisions from. You're just responding immediately to stimulus. You're just sensorial, like a total sensorial being with no memory. That is just kind of, so it's this kind of total agent, but with no kind of reasoning power. And then to be pure memory is to have all the answers, but none of the capacity to act on that. And we wanted to make a sculpture which is kind of allegorizing that, but it's so the symbolism in it. I don't think you're going to look at it and necessarily get what we were putting in from the sculpture, but that was the impetus for the sculpture. And so there's this from an Indian text. There's this metaphor of the this kind of Cartesian dualism thing, that there's the charioteer and the horses are the five senses, and the charioteer is at the center trying to direct activity, and he's trying to rein in all of these wayward senses. So the idea of the chariot came from this model, but then it just became this kind of, the more we worked in it, the more kind of baroque it got, and Niels wanted to make these bat creatures that were kind of like the three fates, weaving the kind of strands of the muscular tissue that then turns into this kind of woven brain kind of memory center at the center of it, basically.
And is this idea of kind of pure presence, pure consciousness, or pure memory, something that you're trying to sort of draw a parallel with your thoughts on taste, or?
Hard to say about taste. I mean, are you pointing in terms of in the pure sense of that?
Or just more what you said about this idea of taste on one hand being a kind of matter of judgment, and on the other of the body, and that those things are always kind of indexically related, but also somehow separated out, right? If you have refined tastes, you're trying to always deny the body in a sense.
I hadn't drawn that link, but I'm glad. I think it's good that you're drawing that link for me. You can do the work of the critic on that one. But no, that's really good, and you're absolutely right. I think, that there is this. There's never one nor the other. Nothing is pure. There's this great film, actually. Have you seen Penda's Fen?
No.
It's this conservative teenager in the 60s whose his dad is a priest, but he's gay. He just doesn't know it himself yet, and he's obsessed with purity. And then he has this kind of mystical revelation, and all these pagan spirits come and speak to him in his dreams and talk to him about the fact that purity, there's no such thing as purity. Everything is containing the other within it. Super beautiful, kind of folk horror. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, there's almost a kind of folk horrorish kind of image at the beginning of the show as well, that leaf eating a moonbeam, which is kind of a very interesting. It also has in the background the letters PHOTO, I think, and it seems to be almost a kind of inversion, right, of photosynthesis, maybe this kind of image of photography in the dark room. Why this kind of almost image of inversion of the leaf at night to begin the show? I think
there's a number of works in the show which are kind of around the same theme, which is about photosynthesis. And there's these various paintings kind of point to or allude to photosynthesis. And it was something that I was thinking about as a kind of, if you imagine that the sun is embodied or is a person, is a character, then the sun is looking at you, and the rays of the sun are kind of somebody's eyes on you, and photosynthesis could be the response to being watched. And so I was thinking about it as a kind of metaphor for embarrassment, and the idea of embarrassment or shame is always like, you don't get embarrassed when there's nobody to see you, or you suddenly, it's this thing that makes you aware of your body, and you suddenly become very physical when you get seen like this. And so I was really obsessed with the idea of thinking about plants as almost these unwilling participants participants in this circle of life, that they're, just by being seen, that makes them grow, that makes them be in the world. And it was just a way to think about being embodied and not in a depressing way, but almost maybe slightly kind of antinatalist kind of position, that it's just like, you don't necessarily have a say. You are involved in the world without wanting to. And anyway, so this
being in the world is fundamentally humiliating in some way. This
I think it's more, maybe more when it turns into kind of like more personal and more kind of diaristic in that sense. It's just my experience of, I was somebody that I do find it. I'm doing this now, and this is hard, but for everyone. But that being in the world is to be seen. And if you're not a natural performer, if you're somebody who's like, I don't know if you're the same, but if you like to kind of read books and be in your own world, sometimes when you have to close that book, open the front door, and go out into the world, just visibility, the fact of being in a body can be quite, it can be intense, it can be quite a tricky thing. And so there's a lot of metaphors that kind of center around that kind of like red cheek and the idea of being seen and this embarrassment in the show. But this specific painting, to circle back to the salad leaf eating a moonbeam, was also the idea of something where it's kind of inverted, that it's a moonbeam rather than the sun. And it was also I was thinking about day and night, that they feel like two parallel worlds sometimes. The kind of idea of what happens at nighttime and what happens in the daytime. Daytime is about, it seems like this is the real world and what gets done, and then there's this mysterious other world of like getting drunk, not remembering. Like it feels like a parallel universe sometimes. And it definitely, in terms of being gay, there's this, that's kind of where you live. Like you live in that kind of, at least when you're like in your early 20s, that's where you kind of find yourself in those kind of nightclubs and things like that, and be who you are. And so this was a kind of attempt to kind of like invert the photosynthesis thing and do it like this. So.
Fran Lebowitz once said that there's never been a time in her life where people were more interesting than the books they'd written. And I think that's so true as well. And that sort of, that nightlife is something you get over at a certain stage.
Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah. But I'm also interested in, I suppose, this idea that you've put out there about incorporation and exposure, but also this kind of ambivalent relationship. Well, there's the images of trepanning that I think are perhaps the most enigmatic in the show, maybe, and that seem to be very much about this process of incorporation and expulsion, or I'm losing my thread here, but that you just said around this idea of, because you have this kind of ear that's bleeding and this demand of the audience, or this demand to go out. And on the other hand, these images of, like in the Alpha Salad, this kind of seed reading, and of this kind of figure of incorporation. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about that.
I mean, specifically about the trepanning thing was, this thing with photosynthesis and the trepanning thing were always at the same time. That was the kind of, it was the same time of thinking of these kind of like grander forces that are imposing themselves on an individual, on the smaller individual. And so with photosynthesis, it was this, I think at most, I would imagine that monotheistic religion, that was like the first, it's always solar religion that kind of predates monotheistic religion. It's this idea that there is a big other in the psychological sense, and it was the sun. And so it's the same vein with the work on trepanning, which are these two sculptures in room 2 of the exhibition. And so they're actually these kind of musical instrument figures with the kind of hole, like woodwind instruments with the hole at the top of their head. And so it's imagining that there is some kind of like larger being that would be kind of playing through them. And it was a way maybe to talk about agency, because this is something that I was interested in a lot in the last year. And throughout the whole show, it's really always talking about this kind of being an object, being an agent, and to move back and forth between those things. But just also that we have this very kind of positive view of agency at the moment, where it's just like it's empowering to be yourself and da da da. But it's also, it feels very limiting somehow to think of yourself as this kind of like very singular identity that is the agent. Whereas I feel like constantly that I'm, as we were talking about earlier in the bar, like I feel sometimes that there's lots of different agents moving through you at any given time in terms of your sense of self. And to kind of say that I'm in control seems like a total lie. And so the idea of trepanning, which is obviously whether you drill a hole in your skull to allow the gods to talk through you, it's this idea of not a religious influence or a kind of deistic influence, but just in general that there's all kinds of things move through you constantly. You're not a kind of sealed border that is an agent. You're constantly prone to being influenced. You're constantly prone to ideology or religion, or all kinds of things move through you. And so this was the trepanning with the woodwind instrument. There's some invisible person who could be playing them, and then you have the audience as well. It's that, so you find yourself in this kind of triangular relationship between not knowing where the things you're saying or doing are coming from, but then also being responsible for them in the world, because you have an audience, you have somebody who's there and connecting you to those things.
Yeah? It's the paradoxical status of both the critic and the artist, right? That on the one hand, you have to speak for a kind of society and therefore to it. You have to be understood, so you have to speak in the orthodoxy, but then you also have to kind of strike out against it to make some kind of original statement, which is always the risk of becoming unintelligible.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But it seems like that, I wonder if that also connects to something about your style as well as an artist, which seems to, many of your works, for example, Alpha Salad, have an almost diagrammatic quality. We have cross sections, we have a seeming progress from seed to plant, and yet at the same time they're also full of anamorphosis. So what seems to be a kind of clear progression, the object then changes into something else, or loses focus, so we're not quite sure what the message is. Could you talk a little bit about how that style developed and what you're trying to achieve with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the diagrammatic thing is really spot on, and it's I always a lot of the references visually for when I'm starting works are coming from graphic design, from posters and things like that, but also from the diagrammatic, because it's just this difference between the edge of an image where you're supposed to read it versus you're supposed to appreciate it or kind of be affected by it. And so that is what I'm always super interested in, is that something that is looks really explicitly diagrammatic, that it's trying to tell you something, but then that itself becomes the kind of affective charge of the image, which is very kind of like mystical or kind of tarot. It has that kind of charge to it. But it's just that to have something that is not, you are supposed to read them, but you're not supposed to read them to get to you're kind of led out in lots of different directions. And that's not from a kind of will to confuse people, but it's more just to it's more from the way that I'm producing the work, which is that it's not coming from I have lots of different things that I'm interested in when I'm making the work, and usually with the show, there's going to be a number of kind of research points that I really want to be in the work, but I also don't know how to facilitate that from a kind of like concept production endpoint thing, because it always fucks up when you do it. Like, well, for me, that always fucks up because you can't escape it. It just gets worse and worse as soon as you try and bring it into the material world. It just looks like a lot worse than where you started from. So you have to kind of I find myself confusing myself as I'm in the process of making the thing. And so by the end, the paintings do take a long time to make, even it may not look like it, but there's a lot of process that goes into it. And by the end, it becomes almost kind of like strange loopy in a way, that it's answering its own questions, but it's not necessarily my question anymore. I went somewhere with that.
That's totally right. And it takes us back almost to that kind of trepanning figure, which is maybe, we talk about agency and we think of our agency as being kind of self-knowing or self-aware, right? And yet sometimes it may be that our position is that point in which what we've learned and what we know becomes kind of jumbled up or strange even to ourselves inside of that. Because a lot of your earlier work has lots of these kind of images of, I think the writer in Flashheart called it incorporation, of this idea of taking in influences that's at once potentially cynical, this kind of being a subject to ideologies. So there were lots of images of construction, of building before, and yet at the same time, it's also a means of transforming them through the personal as well. So, you know, that the image of a religious authority, I'm thinking of kind of works in the show Uranus, they become kind of queered or cruisy, or the policeman who's kind of surveying a territory to kind of weed out crime becomes kind of potent with almost euphemistic potential of his own. But it seems like in this show, the idea of incorporation via eating and digestion takes on other meanings as well that sort of drift away from that idea of influence. Could you talk a bit about...
I just want to kind of like touch on you were talking about the earlier works and using these different kind of construction worker, policeman. The reason I was going for it was always these identities that were very kind of, they always had these different angles, specifically within the kind of gay canon. They're well rehearsed in that kind of vibe, and that they had these really complicated messages between them in terms of, like, for the construction worker, it was this identification with working class, but then it also, like,
gentrification.
But absolutely, but also it's this idea of a kind of socialist kind of model, which is also valorizing a very kind of masculinist view. Like, it was that these were archetypes, not specific to kind of gay male identity, but very much played out in gay male identity. But they had so many points of flight from them. Yeah. So when you start to play with the image, you could just, it's, again, because I'm kind of going into making those images in a kind of like, it's the kind of palette of different kind of symbols that you place together, and they play out in different ways. And they're very charged, obviously, with the police officer. That's such a charged thing to address. And there's so much problematic use of, it is a problematic character in a kind of like sexualized identity and but it becomes super productive to use them as a kind of language, as a kind of to structure them together as a language. And now I need to address the second part of what you said, which was about this show, but about explicitly about
these ideas of incorporation. Yeah. So there's before been how, let's say, we digest or manipulate often ambivalently figures of authority, let's say, and yet here digestion or that kind of ingestion seems to take on other meanings that are very different to the kind of authority or ideology, maybe.
I think what I was interested in, one of the central kind of, so in the show, one of the central kind of figures is this figure of the lobster, and that was the kind of impetus for the whole show, was this idea of the lobster that, that when you boil it alive, it changes color, and it goes from this kind of very drab, kind of bluish gray to this bright red, and it feels almost like this is the tell-us of the lobster. It seems to be telling you that it wants to be eaten because it becomes so beautiful at the point of death. But the other reason for the lobster was also to kind of make a metaphor for transubstantiation. And so transubstantiation is this idea of, in Christianity, but specifically in the Catholic Creed, of the body of Christ being transformed into, or the bread and the wine being turned into the body and blood of Christ. And then this, but that it was the ingestion of it into the parishioners, and how I like the idea in that image that it's incorporation, where usually when you're eating something, it's you taking something else, taking its kind of like nutritional value, and taking that for yourself, absorbing it into you, dissolving it into your own body. But then in this model of transubstantiation, you're taking the body of Jesus Christ into you and then absorbing it into you. But there's an inversion there, because you absorb it into you, but it's supposed to transform you into it from the inside. And this is something that Philip K. Dick in his in there's a book by Philip K. Dick called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which is about this alien creature who basically is transubstantiating himself through the universe by getting people to take this drug. And when they take the drug, he extends his reach, his physical form through the universe in this way. And so what I like with this is that it's this incorporation, but it's an inversion as well. So it's the thing inside you transforming you from the inside out, which is obviously the same with a kind of maybe a metaphor of virality or of infection. Is the same kind of thing, and it's obviously there's a lot of discourse around that, and there's a well-worn kind of discourse around that. But this was the interest for the show, the idea of that eater-eaten kind of inside-outside thing being kind of like the boundary being getting kind of troubled a bit, basically.
But throughout the show, also there's this play between the kind of transformation of the lobster, which becomes red, and these kind of flushed cheeks that we see throughout. Sometimes the flushed cheeks, perhaps, of the gourmand who is eating the lobster, but more often the servers, these very uniform waiters who seem, in a sense, homoerotic because duplicated in a certain sense. But I suppose one potential interpretation of that transubstantiation or that kind of metaphysics could be, are you kind of implying that there is a truth to the lobster, a kind of essential self that's getting revealed, or that the blush of the waiter of them being caught out reveals who they really are? Or is it a kind of more ambiguous transformation going on?
I think it's what I was saying before with this playing with kind of the kind of archetypes of the police officer or the construction worker. The waiter and the lobster, they're kind of coming into that as well. And these are all of these identities they're very recognizable, the waiter more than the lobster, clearly, but they're very readable and they're very recognizable, and they're identities that we find ourselves in. And the one of the waiter, like I did do silver service waiting like early in my 20s, but I spent most of my 20s working in some way in the service industry. And one of the points I wanted to make with the waiter was that it is a mask that you, in contrast to being the chef, to be behind the scenes is to give your labor to somebody else and have to work for them. But to be the waiter is to give your service and yourself to somebody else, because you have to perform. You can't be like pissed off about, there's a certain school of French being a waiter, but you're not supposed to be pissed off. You're supposed to perform wanting to do this job as well as doing the job itself. And I thought that was very interesting.
Kind of performance of desire, almost.
Well, it's just that you can't. Yeah, it's like you have to extend and split yourself in that. Wanting to be there kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I will get to answer your question about the essential kind of thing through this a bit, I hope. But that I think there's a similarity between this figure of the waiter and the kind of logic of the closet, which is this, that you have to perform these roles, you have to give your kind of psychological energy to pretend to be a certain kind of person in those kind of roles, those front of house roles, and that there is a kind of splitting of selfhood that happens through that. And at the end of the day, if we go to it from the perspective of the closet, you talk about being in the closet and performing the role of being straight, and then at some stage you're like, no, I'm gay, I'm coming out, and you take the mask off, but it's not like there's no original self underneath that mask. It's masks all the way down. It's just that there's this. I don't locate myself in some kind of like essential kind of thing that there is. If we could just figure it out, we could get to ourselves and we could be free and liberated and stuff like that. I don't identify with that.
No, it seemed that the kind of blush was much more about the relational acts of being in society rather than of the self unmasked or something.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, and I don't need to be kind of self-pitying, but I think most of the show, all of the metaphors tend to circulate around that, the idea of photosynthesis, it's about being seen, being visible, the embarrassment, the blush of it, of
We're
being,
blushing right now.
I cannot remember. This is it. When I was younger, it was like, that was the reason I was so obsessed with this metaphor of blushing, is because it's this thing that happens to you before you know it's happened to you almost. And it's like your body responds even before you have a chance to say it yourself or to express yourself. And that's so like being gay too, is that like people know before you know when you're growing up. The idea that your body speaks before you can speak for it, that's troubles your own agency already, you know. So that's also the kind of parallel there.
And like taste as well, like, you know, these are affects that are the ones kind of in the body, but they're entirely the products of social relations. Did I pronounce the name of the wine right or not? And I flush, I have a bodily reaction to something which is entirely class-based.
Absolutely.
Or have I been caught out, you know, limp-wristed when I should have been, you know, keeping a steady hand. I suppose for me, another one of the, like the trepanning, one of the more enigmatic images in the show is the work Sap Rising, which I had a hard time reading. There's this kind of green leafy figure covered in veins with a kind of veiny candle, maybe an erection, you know, these images of, and of course we think of sap as a kind of vital fluid giving life. At the same time, a sap is also a kind of foolish person or a weakling. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of talk about, is that anywhere near the meaning of the work?
I think for me, that painting, the idea initially was to think about, I was thinking about plants and the idea of plant sentience, in the sense that we're all kind of evolutionary, from an evolutionary perspective, there's a connection between their living things. They have a kind of sentience in that from a very basic level, they move towards the sun, their roots go towards the ground, there is a kind of agency in a plant, but it's not controlled through a central nervous system, it's kind of hormonally controlled. And then I was thinking about plant reproduction and flowering and creating, because, you know, me and my partner moved to the countryside last year, and so it was the first time I've ever had a garden, like properly and so we started planting everything. And this is why there's so much of this kind of work in the show. But we had strawberries, and it's that the flower comes out, and then from that, then it's the ovary, it distends and turns into a fruit. And I was trying to imagine what it was from the perspective of a plant, and kind of relating that to puberty or a kind of hormonal change in you, to imagine that your body is changing. And so to be kind of a witness to your own body starting to fruit things out of it, and the kind of like disturbing relationship that you would have with your own body, not in the kind of body horror sense, but just the kind of like, to be surprised by the things that you do, that your body does. And obviously from a kind of sexualized perspective as well. So this sap rising is, there's definitely, it's definitely hitting on sexuality.
Voluntary and involuntary muscles, which brings us on to the next room, right? That kind of, idea. But I suppose I also, the next room in the show, if we were to send to that, is one where you have the kind of image of a horse, the horse with a lemon, and then these images of muscles. But also in there, you have works by, I'm going to mispronounce this, Katie Kollwitz, an image of workers at the factory gates. And in fact, throughout the show, alongside works that you've made, both for the show and for an earlier exhibition, Omega Salad, you've paired them with objects from the Leeds University Art Collection, I believe. So what was it about Kollwitz's work, which comes up a couple of times, that made you want to pair it with these images of musculature and meat?
Yeah, I think it was just, when I was going into I was never able to actually physically look at this collection before because of coronavirus. So I was looking at the collection all remotely online. And the thing with Kathy, I also don't know how to say her name, Kath Kollwitz, I don't know.
Because we're so working class and authentic, you know.
But the thing with those works was it was something that there are two works in the show. The one is the workers at the factory gates, and it's a weaving factory, I think. And then the other is there are some dead workers, and they've been brought back. I'm assuming after there was some revolt and some kind of like dispute between the factory owners and the police force and the workers. And it was just, for me, a really useful kind of note to put into the show, in that because the show is obviously so concerned with the body and with agency and with all these different things, but then to maybe look at a little bit more top down in terms of the market and labor value and how bodies do get used, not just in a kind of interpersonal level, but on that kind of level. So there's a few different. There's some other works in that room as well, in this muscles room, that I just wanted to point maybe quite directly at the idea of the muscle as the thing that allows you to have agency, the thing that can let you move towards, this is the muscles in my body allow me to maneuver myself through the world, go towards the things I like, away from the things I don't like. So it is the material realization of your agency, but then it's also the thing that you are useful for, and it's what you get used for. And then in the most kind of explicit and graphic way, it's also you can be eaten, you can be flesh, you can be food for somebody else.
Yeah. So. But also on that kind of agency trip, it seems to be becoming a theme, and I didn't expect it to be, is this idea of the kind of decorative and delicious or pleasurable body and the useful body, right? Yeah. Because, there's these kind of sinuous muscles in one of the work that's sort of stretched and then have this head coming out of them, this kind of personified figure that might be a kind of gay muscle Mary, potentially.
This is the other angle of a muscle, is that it's capacity for agency, it's capacity for labor, and it's aesthetic capacity as well, that it's the idealized form, what you can do to your body, and all of these kind of things as well. Absolutely.
Yeah. Which I suppose takes us into the next room, where you have Duncan kind of bathing after Duncan Grant. And Duncan Grant's bathing, if you don't know it, it's a very kind of controversial work when it was made, because of its kind of homoerotic content, these kind of three naked muscular figures at a beach, but it also had a very kind of class dimension, because it was made for a polytechnic, kind of about days out at the beach. So I suppose I was wondering what attracted you to this painting and made you want to transform these muscular figures into kind of lobster men.
I think with the Duncan Grant, and it's in the same room that there's this painting which is referencing a painting by Sergei Eisenstein. And with both of those references, the Duncan Grant and the Sergei Eisenstein, there's something about this thing of, in the Tate's kind of display of it, they don't really address sexuality so much. Maybe they have now, but I remember seeing it years ago, and it's not written about, it's not on the surface, it's just there in the visuality of the painting. And Sergei Eisenstein, the reason I'm obsessed with his drawings is also the kind of narrative of his life, is that if you go onto his Wikipedia page and then you go into the edit side of the Wikipedia page, you see this constant kind of erasure, addition of him being bisexual. And then there's a lot of people from Russia who are trying to constantly pull that out and extrude it from the record. And then there's different scholars, it's just this idea of the visual that kind of like comes before the text that describes it. But I'm being distracted a little bit by that. But there was another thing on Duncan Grant I wanted to mention, which is that he was the boyfriend of Maynard Keynes, which I didn't know how to put that into the show, but I just thought that is fascinating from a kind of like positions of power. Keynesian economics has taken such a huge stranglehold over kind of like Western thinking in terms of that. Not that I have any expertise on that whatsoever. I just thought it was super fascinating.
But there is something kind of economic in the picture as well, because it is these muscular nude men who are fishermen, who are workers. And there's that kind of, I suppose, that kind of ambivalence we might feel about the sexual attraction of class stratification that seems it's another area where pleasure is at odds with our politics, almost, right? The desire for the kind of meathead, and also the desire to kind of resuscitate that figure as an agent or a revolutionary, right?
I think that's it's such a tricky conversation to get into, and I don't feel super confident like getting in there on that, because there's so many different discourses. This is also the figure of, there's different kinds of figures of gay men specifically in history, and one of them is it's this stratified class thing that is just like invisible gay working class with very visible aristocracy or kind of demi-monde or artistic circles that then kind of like have their bit of trade or their thing. I don't know how to speak to that or talk about it kind of very, very clearly.
Well, it's actually a problem, right? I mean, one of the reasons why queer theory and Marxism have had such a difficult time is that Marxism wants to make decisions, and I count myself as one, make decisions about kind of illusory pleasures of consumption and true pleasures, whereas, queers are perhaps like the kind of moral play in your show, don't really want to differentiate between good and bad pleasures, or authentic, natural pleasures, and and that creates the dilemma, right?
Absolutely. And there's this thing of again, something we were talking about earlier, this thing of productivity and all that it's kind of that it's always instrumentalized, that it's always it's always in the service of being productive, and productivity is like the reason that kind of gay sex is bad historically is because it's not productive. And so we're always caught in this weird kind of especially when you talk about kind of Marxism and communism and things, you cannot escape the relationship to productivity and the value. It's valorizing and identifying with the working class and saying this is like, we are the producers of value, so we need to identify us as the people who have power in that, but it's also valorizing the productive in a certain kind of way, and it's hard.
And it seems bourgeois because so much taste is linked to waste, right? Expenditure, kind of luxury and non-productiveness. But I suppose that the other thing about the Eisenstein image that's very interesting, that comes up in a number of the other works, is that, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's a kind of image that could be a butt fuck, but also is sort of, next to it says the spirit leaving the body, or
life quitting the body.
Life quitting the body. And there's, throughout the show, there are these kind of images. We see a kind of lobster man who's being cooked, and these sort of tendrils of steam rise from them and then go into an almost ghostly forest-like psychopomp, I think that word's called. So what is it about this migration of the soul that's interesting, or why was that an interesting message?
I mean, the life quitting the body, the Sergei Eisenstein reference, the drawing that I referenced in that painting, it is the nervous system like fucking a dead body. Just the idea of this.
We've all been there.
But I just thought, as far as the diagrammatic mixing with the affective, it's so intense that what is that expressing? What is that telling you? It's so symbolic in a way, but it's like the question it's asking is so weird. It's like, what is it? It's talking about like being fucked by your own nervous system. Is like, who do you identify with in that division of things? Are you the body? Are you the nervous system? I just thought it's such a beautiful image. And then the psychopomp painting is this. I think initially the idea, I just was obsessed with the chef's hat as a kind of graphic. This idea of the kind of division. So it's the head and then the chef's hat on the top, and this kind of like puffy cloud, which is, I don't know if, I guess chefs still wear those kind of hats, but it's been so kind of made into a cartoon so many times, it becomes this, like, you just identify it so clearly like this. I wanted to have it as this, the steam kind of culminating at the top of the image and kind of like sticking there, turning into the chef's hat. And then it's also turning into a kind of, it's an afterlife, I guess, at some stage. And it's weird, I'm not religious at all, per se. I don't have a strong position on that kind of metaphysical world. I'm interested in kind of fabulous invention more than I'm interested in a kind of like orthodoxy of specific afterlives or whatever. But I'm obviously obsessed with those kind of things of the body and the soul. There's always these dualisms, and it seems a lot of the work is very binaristic in that sense, but it's because I'm trying to, I don't know, it feels like I'm trying to exercise it as a demon or something, this binarism in it.
Or maybe like Bergson, you're holding things apart only to kind of collapse them,
Exactly,
right? Because it seems like that kind of idea of the migration of the soul, or this kind of moment in sex of leaving the body, seems to kind of collapse the Catholic decadent streams throughout the show as well, which is very prevalent. And we have sort of alongside small images of monks seemingly rewiring a brain in the kind of conflicts of interest.
So this is this is. It's from an anatomy book that I have, and it's supposed to be. It's a close-up of the tongue and the taste bud on the tongue. So it's a very explicit point at taste itself. And so you have this kind of, the taste bud is being kind of an anthropomorphized, and it's given a face on the side, this kind of pre-Raphaelite face, and then you have a monk rewiring the taste bud itself. So it was to really explicitly hammer home this differentiation between taste as a kind of, I say it in the video for the show, I said that, if the mouth is kind of the antechamber for the stomach, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it's like what is allowed inside the body and what has to be kept out. So the mouth is the thing that decides. But then it's also the mouth is a kind of locus of pleasure, not just for food, but for sex. It's a sexualized organ. I mean, I think so. But that it's, so this idea of taste this is one of the final works of the show, and it's making it very, to me, very explicit. But obviously, it's the image itself is so kind of it zooms you in so much that you wouldn't have a clue necessarily what you're looking at.
But I suppose that image could be read, since it's titled "Conflict of Interests," as almost a kind of conflict between moral taste, good taste, that kind of wiring of the taste buds, and taste is pleasure, which is sometimes immoral. But what I'm sort of getting at with this kind of idea of the transmigration of the soul is that you seem to also be putting the figure of the decadent or the pleasure seeker and certain forms of kind of Catholicism as not opposed in that sense, but actually very, very close.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there is a quote, and it's about decadence and the decadent writers, and I can't remember who was saying it, but basically it was that they all did all the drugs known to man, and they were writing about their life and living these extreme kind of lives, and either they died when they were 28 or 29, or they became very religious and ended up their life being joining a nunnery or something. Like, it was this very extreme thing, and I just found that super interesting that those two very different things might be aligned. But I can understand, especially with Catholicism, that they would be so aligned, because Catholicism is it's a very extreme, I think the reason that the Romans hated the Catholics was also they thought they were like a death cult. They were just constantly talking about, it's so much about flesh, it's so much about blood, it's about eating other people, it's really decadent, basically, I think. And so I just wanted to point to it more and more. And see a kind of aligning with this, that, when we talk about Catholicism, we're always contrasting it with Protestantism, which is has a relationship to the kind of dawn of industry and product and productivity and work and all these kind of things. And Catholicism seems to be very much tied to the old world of kind of almost paganistic kind of fetish objects of Christ bleeding out of his stigmata. It's very... It seems to be, the reason that it was rejected a bit by Luther, and I'm not an expert in all this actually, but that it was like, it's backwards, and it has this very kind of like fleshy kind of physical thing to it.
Yeah, I suppose before we sort of switch to questions from the audience, I suppose the one thing that I want to kind of clear up is you talk about this kind of paganism there, and certainly a theme throughout previous exhibitions of yours, there's been almost this kind of return to a kind of maybe pre-Christian or pre-industrial, pre-lapsarian almost kind of history. So I think about shows where you've looked at the counterculture and the what's that?
Witchcraft and the gay counterculture.
Witchcraft and the gay counterculture, or the carnivalesque, this kind of moment where the divisions of public and private or self and other were kind of broken down. And I'm wondering if this kind of, you're proposing this decadence almost as a kind of redemptive alternative to a kind of Protestant streamlined, oriented and organized world of discrete pleasures, or is it not?
I think it's the same, maybe on the same kind of vein in the way that we've been talking up until now. It's like I think this idea of the return to nature, return to the pagan values, it's not, I don't identify with that as a kind of liberatory kind of move that we can all make and everything's going to be better. It's not, there's no utopia there either. But it's not just holding fascination for me, but I think a lot of people have fascination, a lot of artists at the moment, there is this kind of obsession with this
queering nature, or
and taking it to extremes, and maybe kind of this using history in ways, and I guess also the thing with kind of this kind of pagan thing is it kind of sits before history a bit, so you can make of it whatever the fuck you want, and that is fantastic, but it's also it could be anything. You're allowed to do whatever you want.
It's allegory rather than archaeology.
Exactly, and it's. I'm not being suspicious of that. I think it's totally fine, but it's not. It's a space to play around in terms of revisionism and things like that. In the same way that the Middle Ages was created as retroactively was created as that kind of space for certain people. But yeah.
Well, I've got 20 more questions, but I think we have to hear from other people if we must. As tastemakers, we tend not to listen to the hoi polloi. Did anybody have? Yeah.
Thank you so much for such an illuminating conversation. I feel like I've just been digested and stuff. I can't get it. I still want to be inside.
If I've made you feel like shit, my job has been done.
So I just wanted to open up the floor with questions in the room and also online. We've had one of which is about the pairing of alpha salad with omega salad at 17, and actually is there any kind of wider readings that you'd like people to draw from, I guess, it's body of work as a pair as well. If that's a complete body of work, really.
I mean, it's with this show at 17, which was called Omega Salad. It was always focused at the end of life. It was supposed to be the end of that kind of food chain. It was supposed to be this afterlife, or this kind of metaphysics and moving from the physical realm into another realm. And I think what was great about being able to do the show here was to really extend the front end of that, and not to, again, just to explicitly say I'm not religious, but I seem to be so obsessed with it. But to talk from alpha to omega is to talk from kind of cosmogony to apocalypse, and to talk about it as a kind of like that, just to really get to make it really explicitly narrative and really start to end, basically. So that was the reasoning for that. But in the show, Alpha Salad and Omega Salad were in the same room but beside each other, and it was also to point, because in Omega Salad you have these figures of the waiters, and it's these kind of like painted faces with these painted embarrassed cheeks, and it's very artifice. It's very removed from nature. And then I wanted to show nature also as complete artifice as well. So you have this seed that's in the ground, and watching that there's this kind of green kind of portrait beside it that's kind of willing it to grow. And this is supposed to represent the spirit of nature or something like this. But just to say that this is also a kind of like compromised situation. It's why the hell? So you see the seeds growing above the one seed, and then being plucked and then being sold at the market and this kind of thing. So it's just to try and like I balanced them in the space in 17 just to really explicitly say these are both constructs. The nature is always formed in opposition to culture, but it's also just as constructed as culture. So yeah, that helps.
Thanks, Justin. That's perfect. Do you feel like this is the end of body work for you? Do you feel like,
I've been taking a break from making work recently, and I'm living in France, so we have this TV show, station Arte, and they have lots of documentaries on the Irish famine. And for some, I'm Irish, so I started watching them. And I think that I'm going to start making work which is continuing the theme of food, but taking it to a very... I've been talking to my gallerist and saying I want to make a show about the famine, and I don't know how. He's really supportive, but it's not the most sexy subject for a show. But I think I'm going to continue the subject.
Yeah. You can't really extend the theme of decadence into the decadent potato.
but it's so there's so much in the thing with the famine is so interesting because it's just from an Irish perspective. It's really about how England looked at Ireland. And there is something about decadence there to be found, actually, because there was, I can't remember the guy's name, Trevelyan, I think, but he because of the potato is a crop that's super easy to grow. You don't have to work that hard to survive. So you can be poor, but you can eat. And so he was very annoyed with the Irish because they were all poor, but they had this crop that sustained them, but it was just this one crop. But there was such a rich kind of like social culture. They were dancing, they were like telling stories. There was this like, not to kind of romanticize it too much, but he was annoyed because he was like, they're not working hard enough. And so when the potato famine came, he was like, this is God telling them that they're feckless and lazy. So I think there is something there about decadence, about pleasure, but it's going to be a hard show to make, I think.
We'll see how long
Yeah.
Have we got any other questions before you? Yes. Maybe that's you.
I know you're talking about how, like, to understand taste and to appreciate, like, the taste of food, you have to have that somewhat sophistication. You have to, like, understand why different things taste different ways. And I was just wondering if you thought that applied to art, and if you thought, like, to be a good painter, you need to understand, again, that sophistication and have those years of study.
Yeah. Okay. I was thinking.
I teach at a university, so I would say yes, and you need to spend thousands of pounds to achieve it.
I was thinking about this. That is the answer.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the idea of taste as kind of like today. You recommended this book, Strange Gourmet, which is a really good book to read. Paul Litvak?
Joseph Litvak.
Yeah. But just they were talking about the idea of sophistication and that taste is, there is taste that comes from outside, and it's about kind of like sophisticating your own, it's aligning yourself with whatever group you want to align yourself by taste, basically. And I was thinking about that in terms of food, and there is this kind of thing where you're growing up and, you know, your parents give you like an olive and it's disgusting, and they're trying to tell you, it's like, oh no, there is something to be got there. So I was thinking that there's two kinds of taste that come from outside, and one is something which is like, you need to be told what is good and what is bad, and it's instructive in a very kind of clear and defined way. And there is another kind of taste which is just like, hey, there's pleasures that you haven't understood that could be pleasurable. Let's open up this sphere of the world for you to take pleasure in. And so I think to relate that to painting, you just have to be careful that you're not aligning yourself with the kind of like, I'm going to try and figure out what is the thing that people want from painting and replicate that, but just to broaden your horizons and to be opened up to new, to find taste in good taste in bad painting and things like that, but in a very, that it's productive rather than to repeat somebody else's kind of paradigm, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that in Bourdieu's distinction, you know, the idea of good taste is related to your habitus, right? So, I mean, Wagner may be great taste if you're upper middle class, but if you're working in a factory where everybody else is listening to, I don't know, hip hop or whatever, it won't give you that much cultural currency.
absolutely.
In fact, it will give you the opposite of cultural currency.
Yeah.
And we tend to forget that actually there are many taste cultures, and the currency something has depends on what culture you're in. But I suppose in an increasingly centralized and marketized art world, there is only one taste culture.
Yeah.
And that ability to have different currencies gets forgotten.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
But I think it's specific to the art world and taste is that ship moves very fast, and that taste changes very fast. So if you kind of like hitch yourself to something and it goes really quickly, it's a dangerous game to play. You just need to go. You need to go with broadening your own taste, following your own interest. It's dangerous to try and. That's what I guess that was my point with the thing with the olives is that. There are things that are instructive that come from the outside, but they have to open that basically. They have to be, revelatory. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any more questions? Brian?
I was just going to ask about. It's just really interesting about. I guess. I don't know how to think about it, but actually, the style of it. And actually, when you're talking about looking at diagrams and finding those I hadn't thought about that. I guess I kind of see that actually in your work. I guess I was just wondering about when you're making your work, what do you think of it's kind of going through your mind about? I think when we were doing gallery tours, one actually about the colours. Just those kind of really, I guess, kind of prosaic decisions that you're making, but actually making.
Sure. I have no idea. But in the style, just to talk about the style thing a little bit, that I don't make a claim. I mean, I'd love to imagine that people might see me as someone who's very pluralistic in terms of the styles that he is. I know I lean really heavy on this Art Nouveau. I lean very heavy on certain kind of modes of things. But I really, when I'm making work, the hope is that style is also part of the language of the. It's not being read as, I'm not trying to identify myself as a kind of Art Nouveau painter. It's more to speak through these languages and use them as part of the kind of like structure of the work in terms of what its meaning could be. So, I did a show in Vienna, and I was reading this very famous Adolf Loos Against Ornament text, and getting very annoyed about that, and then thinking about Art Nouveau because it's talking about the how functionless it all is and how it doesn't do anything. But then obviously the body is the most Art Nouveau. Like if you look at diagrams of the nervous system and of the veins, it's so ornamental, but ornamental, it's like your nervous system is your body drawing a map of itself in itself. It's super beautiful. But the hope is that the styles are my pleasure that I take from using and seeing those styles, and I really enjoy certain modes of making work, but also that they could be read as into the kind of the subject and the meaning of what the work would want to be. If that makes sense. Right.
Thanks so much. Incredible.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here tonight, especially for those of you generously support us with the donations for the ticket. That's really much appreciated. We also have some audience finding surveys as well as the tables. If you have 17 minutes for them, that would be much appreciated. Otherwise, you'll have thoughts with them. Thank you so much again.
When does the show close?
Show closes on the 8th of May.
Okay.
So plenty of time to see it. And we will also be releasing an online version of the show in a digital format. So if you're watching remotely and you're able to access the show that way as well, and that's also possible. And we will be having a